The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Buenos días, señoras y señores. Good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining this webinar on IEA's Mexico Energy Outlook, which looks at Mexico's energy demand and supply outlook to 2040. I apologize for the delay in advance. This webinar today is based on a publication produced by the International Energy Agency with the same name. It's available for free on our website in English, as well as the executive summary in Spanish. The Secretaría de Energía are working to translate the report to Spanish soon. The webinar is organized by the International Energy Agency with the kind support of the Secretaría de Energía. My name is David Morgado, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. And I'm joined by my colleagues Tim Gold, head of the Energy Supply Outlook Division, and Ali Al-Safar from the IEA's Energy Supply Outlook Division. And they'll be carrying out this presentation today. And here you can see the team for today. Before we start, I'll go through the agenda for today. So we'll have a brief introduction on how the webinar works. Welcome remarks by Santiago Crujeras, who's the Director General of Efficiency and Sustainable Energy at CENER. We'll also have Tim talking a bit about global energy context, and then we'll go on to looking at Mexico's energy context and the no energy reform scenario, and also a couple of slides on energy and air pollution. And finally, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and discussions. We'd really like to hear from you and like to include your voice in the conversation, so please ask questions and share comments so that we can discuss these at the end of the webinar. To do so, before we start the webinar, we would like to go through the setup of the webinar and let you know how you can participate in today's session. The slide shows an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer. You have joined today's webinar listening through your computer speaker system by default. This means if you usually can hear music on your computer, you'll be able to hear the presentation. If you'd like to call in using the telephone, just locate your audio pane and select Use Telephone. The dial-in information and access code will then be displayed. The number and access code are indicated on this slide as well here at the bottom. You also have the ability to ask questions using your questions pane. Simply type in your question either in English or Spanish and click Send. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time for discussion and go through the questions you submitted during the presentation. Please note that we'll be recording the webinar, and we'll make the link available for those who have missed the webinar, as well as if you want to share it with colleagues or would like to go over it again. So unless there's any questions at this time, I'm just going to now set up and proceed with introduction speech by Santiago Crujeras, so Director General for Efficiency and Sustainable Energy from CENER. So just give me a second. Santiago, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, David.
Perfect. Hi, good morning. We can hear you perfectly.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for the opportunity. On behalf of the Ministry of Energy, I would like to thank the International Energy Agency for this webinar. I would like to thank you, David, and thank Tim and Ali for sharing with us the Mexico's energy outlook. I'm sure that it's one of the greatest publications about Mexico's energy sector, especially during this administration where we have just had the reform. Me gustaría darle también la más cordial bienvenida a todos los participantes a este webinar. Esta iniciativa conjunta que iniciamos la Secretaría de Energía de México y la Agencia Internacional de Energía ya ha incluido más de 13 webinars, han participado más de 1,600 personas y si consideramos las 304 personas que se encuentran conectadas en este momento, pues prácticamente ya son alrededor de 1,900 personas las que han participado en los webinars de la Secretaría de Energía y la Agencia Internacional de Energía. Creo que esto es una práctica que se ha vuelto muy exitosa y que nos está permitiendo conocer muchas de las publicaciones y de los trabajos de la agencia en México, y sobre todo ahora que México se encuentra además en un proceso de adhesión a la Agencia Internacional de Energía de manera formal. Respecto a la publicación sobre la cual vamos a hablar el día de hoy, la perspectiva de la energía en México, tiene realmente un par de objetivos muy importantes. El primero es difundir los principales hallazgos encontrados durante la evaluación del impacto a largo plazo de los cambios introducidos por la reforma energética, así como considerar los posibles efectos para el desarrollo económico y objetivos ambientales de México. Algunos de los datos que me gustaría destacar son que el rumbo del sector energético previo a la reforma no era sustentable. Los beneficios acumulados del PIB gracias a la reforma hasta 2040 se calculan en más de $1 billón en comparación con un caso de no implementación de las reformas. Una exitosa reforma de la energía garantizará la inversión en suministro energético por una cantidad muy importante, alrededor de $240,000 millones en el sector eléctrico, 640,000 millones en exploración y producción y 130,000 millones adicionales en eficiencia energética. La mayor apertura del sector eléctrico a la participación privada nos permitirá movilizar alrededor de $10,000 millones anuales hacia 2040. Los precios de la electricidad industrial disminuirán en alrededor de 14% en términos reales con un sistema eléctrico más eficiente, y la nueva política energética y el nuevo diseño de mercado también constituyen un fuerte impulso para los avances en energía limpia realizados por México. Esto creo que también es muy relevante. Más de la mitad de los 120 gigawatts de capacidad de generación eléctrica nueva instalada hacia 2040 será renovable. Así que bueno, pues esto se alinea muy bien con todo lo que estamos haciendo en el marco de esta reforma, con la ley de transición energética, con la estrategia de transición energética y combustibles más limpios que publicó la Secretaría de Energía a finales del año pasado, con el Programa Nacional de Aprovechamiento Sustentable de la Energía y el Programa de Transición Energética. Todos estos se encuentran disponibles en la página de la Secretaría de Energía por si alguno de ustedes los quisiera consultar. Y sin más, pues le dejo la palabra a los expertos, a Tim y a Ali, y una vez más, en nombre de la Secretaría de Energía, muchísimas gracias por esta oportunidad y todo el apoyo de la Agencia Internacional de Energía para poder realizar estos webinars. Saludos, David, y que tengan y disfruten esta mañana en este webinar.
Thank you, Santiago, for very kind words and all your support with these webinars. We definitely have a record today of 315 people attending the webinar. So it's again also thank everybody that's listening in and for their continued support in these webinars. Without further ado, I'll pass on to my colleagues Ali and Tim to talk about the Mexico energy outlook. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And good morning, everybody. It's a huge pleasure to have this chance to talk through some of our findings from last year's World Energy Outlook. As was mentioned, we're going to be looking at 3 bits of analysis that we did. The main one, which my colleague Ali will talk about, is this Mexico Energy Outlook. A word of thanks to Santiago Guerreras, to colleagues from SENER for the outstanding cooperation that we received throughout this work last year, and also to the many industry representatives, researchers and others who helped us understand some things about your country and the energy reform and the direction that you wish to go. That's one of the main topics that we want to cover today, but we thought it would also be interesting to cover some of the more generic global context which we can derive from our World Energy Outlook, which was released a few weeks after the Mexico Outlook. So the Mexico Outlook came at the end of October. Middle of November, we released our annual World Energy Outlook, and I'm going to be talking about some of the aspects that I think might be of interest from there. And finally, there's also some work that we did on energy and air pollution. In Mexico, as in many other countries, this has been a real issue of public concern. And so we felt that we would also look at what for us is a very close and interesting set of linkages between urban air pollution in particular and the energy sector. So moving on, I just wanted to start with a few words about the context. There's many things happening in the energy sector at the moment, so we need to, in a sense, have some points of reference, some points of orientation. One of the issues which you're, of course, very well aware of in Mexico is the decline in the oil price, the fall in upstream investment. One of the implications of that is that some of the higher cost supply has been pushed out of the mix, and as a result, lower cost producers, such as those in the Middle East, now have a share in global oil production, which is at levels that we haven't seen since the 1970s. There are very interesting things happening also in gas markets. You have an abundance of LNG available on the market, and that's changing the way that that gas moves around the world, removing some of the rigidities that have previously been associated with LNG trade. Renewables, in many ways, are the big story of the work that we did last year, both in relation to Mexico, but also in our global outlook, which had a particular focus on renewables. One data point for you: if you look at all of the renewable capacity that was added to the power sector in 2015, that was more than all other sources combined, so more than coal, gas, oil, and nuclear combined. And that means that if you look now at the capacity figures for the world as a whole, renewables have overtaken coal, which for us is an important milestone. Now, we're dealing with projections, and one of the important elements that we've included in our thinking about the future in the World Energy Outlook 2016 are all the climate pledges that were made by governments around the world in advance of the COP21 meeting. So when we present our central scenario, our main scenario here, you know, you need to have in mind that these are our understanding of the implications of all of those climate pledges for the development of the energy sector. And this is, in a sense, a global point, but it's a very important one to remember. We're talking often about, you know, excess supply, excess emissions, but there are still many millions, many hundreds of millions around the world that remain without electricity, around 1.2 billion, but also a large share of the global population, 2.7 billion people in our estimate, that rely on solid biomass for cooking, and you know that comes with a range of implications, not least for health, and we'll come back to that when we talk a little bit more about air pollution later in this webinar. It's an unsurprising conclusion. You know, policies change, governments change. For us, as an intergovernmental institution, we think that a crucial element to determine which way the energy sector goes is which way policies go. There's a lot of contingencies there, so there's no single story about the future. For us, it's decisions taken by governments that will be critical in determining where we go. Before passing over to Ali, I did want to just provide some global context in terms of the fuel mix that we see between now and 2040. And one way to think about the future is also just to compare it with the past. And this is what you see for the last 25 years, a 60% rise in global primary energy demand, largely due to the rapid rise of China since 2000. The leading fuel over the last 25 years, the fuel that met more of the increase in global primary demand than any other, was coal. Looking to the future, the next 25 years, we don't have a 60% increase in global primary energy demand. We have around a 30% increase, and that has a lot to do with some structural economic changes in the global economy, but it also has a great deal to do with the increasing stringency and the spread of energy efficiency policies worldwide. I mean, the sorts of things that you've been discussing in this webinar series. And so, you know, that leaves us with a slowdown in the rise in global demand, but also the fuels that were some of the leading fuels over the last 25 years are falling to the back of the pack. The one element of continuity is natural gas, but it's really the low carbon sources that that come through as the new fuel in pole position. A chunk of that comes from nuclear power. Much of that expansion in nuclear comes from reactors that are already under construction. Many of those are in China, but the bulk of it is renewables, from hydro to wind to geothermal and others. And the important thing to note is that this is not something that you can pin to any particular country or small group of countries. This is really a worldwide phenomenon, and a phenomenon, as we'll see, that Mexico is playing an increasingly important part of. And with that brief look at some global context, I pass across to Ali to talk about some of our particular findings in relation to Mexico.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you all for joining us. As Tim mentioned, I'll provide you some of the context for Mexico, and of course, what underpins most of our work, the departure point for us, was we looked at reform, and we looked at what was the case before reform, what was the status quo. And effectively, it was one where oil production was declining. It was has declined by about 1 million barrels a day since its peak in 2004, and what that meant was that in terms of energy trade, we saw a huge swing from going from around a $25 billion surplus just 5 years ago towards a probable negative surplus, so a negative trade balance in the range of about $1 billion last year. In the power sector, what it meant was that the dominance of CFE and the lack of private sector participation meant that the overall sector was quite inefficient, and that could be best illustrated by the fact that network losses were around 14%, around twice the OECD average. The third element that's worth mentioning is that despite the fact that Mexico is so endowed with renewable potential, it was almost entirely untapped, and again that's reflected in the fact that oil makes up a larger percentage of the primary energy mix in Mexico than it does in the Middle East, around 51%. So what we saw when we did our study is that the vision of a more sustainable sector is effectively enunciated in the energy reform, and what this in effect does is that it opens the energy sector towards private sector participants, and should help Mexico secure some of the $40 billion in annual investments it needs across its energy sector. Another important aspect of the reform is the transition to low carbon energy. Already we've seen that Mexico has taken a global role, a global leadership role in this transition. It was one of the first countries in the world to submit a nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC ahead of Paris 21, COP21. And what we believe is that the successful reform will help Mexico meet its targets, both for clean energy and beyond, as it moves ahead with its NDC. So one question that we're asked is, how does the impact of lower oil and natural gas prices, what impact will this have on the reform? On the one hand, of course, the loss of government revenue and upstream capital spending does put downward pressure, but on the other, Mexico has moved very efficiently to try to bring gas into its system, and that's been enabled in large part by the fact that it has access to cheap gas from the southern United States, and that's something I'll speak about later as well. So moving on to the actual system and what it looks like. Mexico in many ways reflects the larger challenges that we see globally. And the main challenge in the energy sector is the one that it manages the relationship between economic growth, energy demand, and emissions. Now, historically, where one has moved, where the others have followed. So when there has been a growth in the economy, it's necessitated a growth in energy demand and therefore a growth in emissions. Now, the challenge, one of the key challenges faced by energy policymakers is to try to break this relationship. And to some degree, what we've already seen happening is that they've managed to do this. In 2014 and 2015, we had 2 consecutive years where growth in CO2 emissions stalled, even though the economy continued to grow. And looking forward, we see Mexico as being a good example of this relationship. What we saw in our modeling is that while Mexico's economy doubles by 2040, primary energy demand grows by much less, by about 1/5. Now, this reflects a number of things, but these include the structural changes happening in the economy, moving towards higher value added products that require less energy to generate a unit of GDP, but it also reflects some of the advances that are being made towards energy efficiency and the more efficient use of energy. A second change is between the energy use and emissions, and a large part of this is the decrease in the prominence of oil in the energy mix. Like I mentioned before, over half of primary energy demand at the moment is met by oil, and with the proliferation of gas and of renewables, we see that this improves a great deal, and Tim will speak to you a little bit about that, about the implications that has, for example, on air quality a little bit later on. From a sectoral perspective, at the moment, demand is very heavily skewed towards transport, which accounts for around 40% of final consumption in Mexico. That's quite significantly higher than what we see in the OECD average. In our projections to 2040, there is some sort of rebalance with industry and buildings both growing at a faster rate. Now, how is this energy demand met in industry and buildings? Primarily through the use of gas and electricity. In industry, this contributes towards growth and competitiveness, specifically through the use of cheap US gas imports. But that also happens alongside changes in the gas market that allows for transparent pricing and private participation. Now, demand for electricity increases faster than any fuel, led by demand in households, and that's reflecting a rise in incomes and, of course, rising appliance use, particularly for cooling. We see that demand for cooling increases threefold to 2040. Now, demand-side measures play a central role in this, and this is where our colleagues in the efficiency unit, including David and colleagues in the IEA and in Senate, have been working closely. But the challenge is, of course, one of implementation. The building codes exist, but it would require a great deal of coordination between state and local authorities to make this a reality on the ground. But also efficiency in the transport sector. This is one of our key stories. What we see is that Mexico's car fleet increases by about 50%, but the energy demand in passenger vehicles only increases marginally, and a large part of this virtually flat increases, or this virtually flat energy story, is the fact that fuel efficiency standards start to come in and start to take a large chunk of that. But the story is significantly different for heavy goods vehicles, where the pace of efficiency improvement is slower. So the increase, trucks effectively account for around half the increase in transport fuel to 2040. Looking at the power sector, we start with what we've already mentioned. So oil plays a prominent role, and Mexico has already taken considerable steps to reduce some of this reliance on oil-fired generation, but it still makes up for around 10% of the total. That compares to around 2% in the rest of the OECD. So what do we expect to happen between now and 2040? The first element is that oil is virtually phased out, and that happens in the short term. At the same time, and going forward, some existing coal capacity is retired, and so we see a decrease in coal-fired generation. We've made some provision for an increase in nuclear-fired generation. We've got about 2 gigawatts coming online, but there's an important caveat here, and that is it will require strong additional mechanisms of support or guarantees, because this is in effect in competition with renewables. And what we've seen from the first two rounds of auctions from last year, the competition is very stiff. And the most distinctive changes happen here in renewables, and this is in effect linked to both the sophisticated market design that was implemented from as a result of the reform, but also the operation of short-term markets and the way that mirrors with the investment security offered by the long-term auctions. So in our projections, more than half of the new electricity generation capacity is from renewables, most of which are wind and solar. Now, as a result of this increase in renewables and also the phasing out of oil and its replacement through natural gas, we project a significant improvement in the environmental performance of the power sector. The 35% clean energy target for 2024 is reached. Generation, of course, rises, but emissions from the power sector actually fall. And what's particularly impressive is that this is achieved despite the fact that because of the competitive market structure and the cost-efficient expansion of renewables, the electricity supply costs are kept in check.
Thanks, Shelley. I would like to just put some of the discussion about the low-carbon transition into a slightly broader context by talking about the role of renewables, not just in the power sector, but also outside the power sector. The discussion about low-carbon energy tends to become very focused on the power sector, and that's understandable given the impressive increase in wind and solar contribution there. But if you look at the data for 2015, delivered heat from renewable sources was almost the same, at almost the same level as delivered electricity from renewables, and that's not widely appreciated. And what is that delivered heat? That can be biomass boilers for industry, it can be biomass heat for the residential sector, it can be things like solar water heaters, which actually are very widespread in many parts of the world. But the difference between the electricity and the heat sectors is that there is a lot more policy attention to the power sector. 150 countries have policies supporting the expansion of low-carbon power, but less than half of that have policies for heat. And so if we look at the way that this plays out over the period to 2040, you get a big expansion in renewable electricity, but a much smaller one for heat. So one general point that we wanted to make from a policy perspective is that the power sector is, of course, increasingly important, and there are many interesting things happening there with Mexico, as Ali mentioned, at the forefront of change. But there's a discussion about renewables beyond there, and so the new frontiers, the next frontiers that policymakers will need to also pay attention to is heat and transport, and that can be either the direct application of renewables, or you can think about electrifying some of these end uses and then providing them with low carbon power. And since the focus is here on transport, where of course electrification is very much an option, I thought it would be interesting to say a few words about how we see the evolution of global oil demand, because there's of course a big discussion going on at the moment about what implications the rise of electric mobility, the rise in the popularity and the range of models available of electric cars, what implications might that have for the future of oil demand. And our position is clear from the title of this slide. Even though some people are talking about the possibility of a peak in oil demand, but sometime within the next 5 to 15 years, we don't yet see it. And I wanted to explain why that is the case. And in order to do so, it's helpful to think through some of the different ways in that oil is used in the energy system. Ali's already mentioned power generation. And Mexico is a good example of a country that's clearly going to use less oil in the power sector in 2040 than it does today. Buildings, likewise, there are many alternatives to the use of LPG in the building sector. So it's no surprise that oil use in those sectors is set to decline. What's perhaps a little bit more noteworthy is that we are projecting now, for the first time in World Energy Outlook 2016, a decline in oil demand for passenger cars. And that's despite a very large expansion in the global car fleet. So roughly 1 billion cars on the road today, roughly 2 billion in 2040, but they use less oil. Why is that? By far the biggest contributing factor is fuel efficiency standards, which, you know, they save an equivalent of around 11 million barrels a day of 2040 oil demand. There's also a contribution from biofuels and natural gas. But the interesting element now is the expansion of electric mobility also plays quite a significant role in moving that column into the negative. So if all of this is true, then why do we continue to see an increase in overall oil demand? And that's because there are other parts of the energy system that rely on oil and where substitution is that much more difficult. It's international shipping, it's heavy-duty freight, jet fuel for aviation, and also the oil that goes in as a feedstock to the petrochemicals industry. All of those areas are efficient. These are all areas where efficiency policies are not that widespread, and where in any case they're actually quite difficult to implement. And so this is then the reason for our overall projection on oil demand. And I think while I'm on the topic of oil, just a few words, because this is a potentially very important issue for a country like Mexico with a very well-developed upstream sector. We are concerned that we may be entering a period of greater oil market volatility. And I wanted to just explain why. As you may be aware, 70% of oil output comes from conventional crude oil projects. So not the oil sands, not the US shale oil, but your traditional conventional crude projects of the sorts that Mexico has specialized in. But the approvals of new projects over the last 2 years is back to levels that we haven't seen since the 1950s. And what that means is that that creates the risk of a supply-demand gap in a few years' time, because, as you know very well in Mexico, all the production from existing fields is subject to this inexorable decline, and so those declines, which amount to losing the equivalent of Iraq from the global oil balance every couple of years, that needs to be compensated by new projects feeding into the system. And if you get a gap in that pipeline of new projects, in that conveyor belt of new projects, then you risk running into difficulties. And that's the situation which we see ourselves in now. One possibility that is often discussed is that US tight oil, US shale oil provides a potential lifeline. And that's indeed true. The potential for US production to increase quickly in response to short-term price signals is I think, well established. That's certainly something that we would subscribe to. But don't forget, we're talking about something that may not happen in the next few years, these are projects with long lead times, the conventional crude oil projects. So any shortfall wouldn't happen until the end of this decade and into the 2020s. And the sort of surge response capacity of US shale oil by that time may be considerably less than it is today. So our conclusion, and this is an area where the sorts of investments that we are welcoming in Mexico's upstream plays a significant role, is that there is this risk to the baseload of oil supply, and tight oil cannot be relied upon to cover this potential shortfall. And that provides a good lead-in to Ali saying a few words about our views on the Mexican upstream.
Thank you very much, Tim. So on the Mexico upstream and our expectations for what the reform can achieve, I'll start off by giving the story to date. Effectively, it's one of decline, of steady decline, despite the best efforts of Pemex. Latest numbers around 2.1 million barrels a day, so even below what was shown in this chart in 2015. Now, as Tim already mentioned, the key underlying issue for Mexico and elsewhere is the decline in existing fields. He mentioned that it's the equivalent of losing in Iraq every 2 years, but that it also accounts for more than 80% of worldwide investment in oil and gas is just made to counteract the effects of this decline. Now, given the long lead times for these projects, again, as Tim mentioned, it could take between 3, 5, even 7 years. It's clear that the reform can't deliver a quick turnaround in output. But what it can do is work on some other pillars. Now, through the reform, by the fact that Pemex can focus on its areas of strength and the fact that private sector investment can be brought in and expertise can be brought in, we expect effectively 3 pillars to happen. The first is the revival of onshore production, and that's with the help of specialized actors helping to get the most out of Chicontepec and other smaller fields, and the start of tight oil production at the early stages of next decade. The second pillar is the possibility for Pemex to form partnerships to get the most out of its shallow water fields where it's already got expertise, but by deploying enhanced oil recovery techniques and tying into additional smaller fields and putting that into the existing infrastructure. And finally, the highly anticipated deep offshore production holds considerable promise, but at the moment presents numerous technical challenges, and it will require a great deal of international expertise, technology, and of course resources. These deep water developments take a little bit longer to come into first oil, but we expect that this starts with the Tryon field and that they gain momentum somewhere in the 2020s. So the net result is that by 2040 we see a return to growth in the oil production, and that Mexico can retain its position as one of the world's leading producers and oil exporters. Now, one exercise that we thought would be important to try to highlight the importance of the reform was to try to figure out what would happen if this reform never took place in the first place. So we modeled across the oil sector, but also for power, what would happen, what we think would happen if these reforms never existed. Now, for the oil sector, what we did was we assumed that none of the reforms were made, and so Pemex retained its monopoly on oil and gas. There's no private sector participation in that sector, nor in the electricity sector. So in the no reform case, it's essentially one where investment is constrained. The investment that is made by Pemex, and what we see is Pemex is into this kind of spiral where it has falling output, and that limits its ability to fund new projects. Now, in such a world, the priority for Pemex would be to probably then focus its efforts on the shallow water project and some of its onshore projects. But the more technically challenging deep water and tight oil plays are held back. And so by the end of the projection period to 2040, oil production is more than 1 million barrels a day lower than in our main scenario. The effects are not only felt in the upstream, refinery upgrades are delayed and in some cases not made, and that's a key outcome of our central scenario, where utilization rates in refineries go back up to 90%, and because of that delay, the no reform case is one where there's an increased reliance on imported refined products. I've mentioned that the no reform case has clear implications on oil production and, of course, therefore oil revenue and exports, but it's also got impacts beyond that. In the electricity sector, we assume, of course, that the fuel switching from oil to gas continues. That's not reliant on the reform, but the other gains from efficiency are more difficult to capture, and so there's slower progress on reducing network losses. They stay quite high, and as a result of that and the lack of progress made on operational efficiency, the net result is one where electricity prices for the qualified industrial consumers that can gain access to in this current market are around 14% higher than in the main scenario. Now, of course, without the policies to increase the role of clean energy that were due to the reform, the clean energy targets are not met in such a scenario. So effectively what we have is a lower upstream investment, lower fiscal revenue from oil, and higher electricity prices. Now they all meet and have a significant impact on the broader economy. And so household consumption is reduced, and the net impact is one where in 2040 the economy of Mexico is $100 billion smaller than it otherwise would be. So if you take that cumulative loss between now and 2040, it amounts to around $1 trillion. Now, with that, I'd just pass over to Tim, who's going to speak a little bit about our third report from last year, the air pollution.
Yeah, a few concluding words on two sort of sets of environmental implications of some of these projections. The first is an issue related to the impact of the energy sector on air pollution. And this is a generic point, but just to make it clear that the vast majority of the main pollutants, so nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and fine particulate matter, the vast majority of global man-made pollutant emissions come from the energy sector, different parts of the energy sector. For nitrogen oxides, that's primarily oil products, that's primarily in relation to transport. Sulfur dioxide is largely related to coal, but you also have some high sulfur oil products still circulating in some countries and in some sectors. Fine particulate matter, that's related more to the incomplete combustion of biomass, and that has a lot to do with the continued use of solid biomass as a cooking fuel. Now, in the analysis that we did last year, we looked at some global aggregates, but really this is an issue that requires much more disaggregated treatment. So we did have a section in the book on Mexico. We're of course well aware that this has been a policy priority for Mexico for many years. It's something that is very much highlighted in Mexico's COP21, the climate pledge. We looked at the impact of policy packages like the Pro-Air that have had a significant impact, and in our view, you're still going to see this divergence in the future between energy demand, which grows, and pollutant emissions of these sources, which in our view in Mexico will continue to decline by between sort of 20 to 40%. And that doesn't mean that the problem goes away. And there, I think, there are some particular local conditions, not least of which is the sort of altitude of many of Mexico's largest cities that have play a big contributing role. But part of the solution is related to the energy reform in the sense that you move away from a system that is so dependent on fuel combustion and more towards one that deploys sources like wind and solar energy that obviously do not produce any of these emissions. And part of the solution as well is to ensure good pollution controls for those sources that continue to use fuel combustion, whether that's vehicles or large industrial facilities or power plants. And the other point that I wanted to mention was in relation to climate change and overall emissions. In the work that we did last year, we could highlight many countries that were making very significant progress in the energy transition. Mexico is a good example where you start to see country tapping these large resources and putting the emphasis also on the demand side and improvements in energy efficiency. I mean, there are other indicators we could have pointed to. We see a peak, for example, in China's coal consumption. I mean, in our view, that's already peaked as of 2013. You do have a large expansion in electric mobility. You have the progress in decarbonizing the power system, which means that by 2040 you have 40% of all global power coming from renewable energy. And that is all sufficient to slow the growth in global emissions in that central scenario. But it's obviously not close to being enough to achieve the early peak and the subsequent decline in emissions that is consistent with a 2-degree case. And just to stretch that out towards the latter part of the century, you need to think, if you're talking about a 2-degree scenario, you need to look further ahead to a point where sometime in the second half of the century, and that's what the Paris Agreement mandates, you get to a situation where you have net zero emissions. So anything that continues to be emitted from the energy sector has to be compensated by removal of carbon from the atmosphere. So obviously a long way to go, and it's also worth pointing out that what we've drawn with the green line there is a 2-degree scenario. And as I'm sure you're all aware, Paris doesn't talk about a 2-degree scenario. It talks about well below 2, talks about efforts to pursue 1.5. So the emissions trajectories associated with those ambitions are, of course, much sharper and steeper and imply an energy transition, the speed and scale of which doesn't really have any precedent in energy history. And on those points, I'd just like to come back finally to Ali, who's going to say a few concluding words about our work on Mexico specifically.
Well, thank you, Tim. Again, in conclusion, what we've tried to show through our study is to show what the reform, what the route looks forward to Mexico, what it looks like for the energy sector, what the implications are for environment, and also on Mexico's entire economy. Now, the changes introduced by the energy reform, these in our minds help to generate some of the investment required, the $40 billion in energy investment required across the sector, but they also allow the private sector to come in and to alleviate some of the burdens on the state productive enterprises, which then can focus on their areas of strength and focus on efficiencies across the systems that they control. And we see it as a useful mechanism where Mexico can successfully meet its objectives of shifting towards a cleaner power mix, while at the same time making sure that the prices are kept in check and costs are kept in check. What they do in the oil sector is that they return Mexico to a position of growth and cement Mexico's position as one of the world's key oil and gas producers. This is a long way away from the trajectory that was being faced pre-reform. And with that, I think I can pass over to David, who will moderate the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Tim and Ali, for a very interesting presentation. We're now reaching our Q&A session. Just to remind everybody, we've got about 10 minutes left, and basically we want people to ask questions using the questions pane. So simply type in your question either in English or Spanish and click send, and we'll now start discussing them. I'm seeing we've already got a couple of questions so far, so I'll start with the...
I just wanted to say something up front, because I completely understand where the questions are coming from, but you won't be surprised to hear that many of them concern the potential impacts for Mexico of any changes in US policy, whether relating to trade issues or relating to energy issues. Now, I mean, from our perspective, at least from the way that the World Energy Outlook approaches these things, we understand that the policies change over time, and we try and incorporate them into our analysis. The challenge in relation into all the topics that have been mentioned on NAFTA or other cross-border issues is that it is, for the moment, largely speculative. We don't yet have a clear idea of what will be the new policy positions, what will change, what will remain constant from the previous administration. And in the absence of that clarity, it does feel premature from our side to speculate on what some of those changes might be. But of course, you can derive also from the work that we did, that the ties, the integration, both in economic terms and of course in energy terms, has been very profound between Mexico and other countries in North America, and of course particularly the US. And since 2009, automobiles have been a larger source of export revenue than energy. So you have the foundations to think through some of those things, but it just feels too soon to do that in any detail. So David, perhaps you have some other issues that you...
So just going through, we're now starting to get a couple of questions now. So maybe start with the first one. What, in your view, are the biggest threats to the success of the reform? What could go wrong, both in the electricity and hydrocarbons sector?
Now, I think in general terms, as Ali has said, this is a very profound and wide-ranging reform of the sort that has, it's difficult to think of many other examples of something which has been so deep and so broad in terms of the way that the energy sector is. So there is really much to applaud in the way that this has been designed and the way that it's gone ahead. That said, we are still in a relatively early stage, so there is a great deal of implementation, both in terms of actual different bid rounds and different other auctions and so on that need to take place, but also in terms of secondary regulation and stuff which needs to be put in place. If I had to highlight one thing, this is something that's really common across the hydrocarbon and the electricity sector. It's the challenge of ensuring that you really do have a competitive level playing field for the incumbents and potential new entrants in different sectors. That points to the challenge of unbundling, for example, in the electricity sector, which is clearly going to be an important indicator of the prospects as we move forward. A related issue is that you now have all sorts of new institutions that have been created in order to oversee this transition to a fully open system. And those institutions also need capacity. They need in some cases they need time to develop the staff. I mean overall, I think I can speak for the whole group that we were very highly impressed with the quality of the people who we interacted with in across different Mexican energy institutions. But those institutions are new and will need time and will need support in order to take up these important roles in the system. So I think those two are the areas that I would point to as particularly important.
Yeah, and just to carry on that thought, the new institutions, one of them is ASEA. Thank you. And that points to one of the concerns that I would like to kind of highlight, and that is of trying to ensure, and this is specifically for or primarily for electricity projects, some sort of kind of community buy-in for some of these projects. We've seen that there's already processes put in place where there's discussions, where there's work with communities to ensure that these projects go ahead, but this could be a source of delay and potential roadblocks as well. Like I said, ASEA is specifically designed to deal with this kind of thing, but it is a nascent institution, and that's a concern that I imagine they have.
So we're getting a lot of questions, so I'm trying to choose which ones we can answer. So I think the second one is on, do you expect a rebound in oil and gas prices? Is that positive for the reform or not?
I think it's, I mean, in the same way that you could argue that the decline in prices has been, in a sense, it's had a mixed bag of impacts on Mexico. Clearly, on the fiscal side, although the economy as a whole is very diversified, I mean, there is still, or there has still been, a relatively high dependence on revenue from the hydrocarbon sector. Although the tax base has been, I mean, there have been measures to broaden the fiscal reach and so on away from oil and gas. So there are vulnerabilities associated with a fall in price. In the same way, there would be vulnerabilities associated with a rebound. You would reverse some of those impacts in terms of the revenues available to the state and to Pemex. But you're also now talking about a liberalizing system, and a liberalizing system means that you would expose also your end consumers to some of those increases in prices. So some of this would be passed on to consumers, and as we've seen in many countries, including Mexico, and that's not without the possibility of a social and a sense of political reaction. There are many parts of the world that have taken advantage of the fall in hydrocarbon prices to reform their system of energy subsidies. India is a good example. Indonesia is a good example. But there is, you can see, and Indonesia here is I think an interesting one. There has been some reluctance to pass on those rises in the oil price that we've seen over the last year to the consumers, and so that creates a certain amount of difficulty. So I wouldn't like to say whether this is a positive or negative. It would have positive impacts in certain parts of the energy system, but it would create some additional challenges for the Mexican policy. But it's indeed true. Sorry, can I just specify that we do envisage in our main scenario an increase in the oil price towards 2020. We're back up in the sort of $70 a barrel in our main scenario, the one that was presented today, by 2020, with some additional increases thereafter. that is not a forecast. That is just the price that balances that scenario. And there is, as I mentioned in the presentation, the possibility that could be accompanied by some quite considerable volatility. In relation to natural gas, the situation is a little bit distinct because we don't see anything like the same pressures for an increase in the Henry Hub price in the US. In our view, that market remains relatively well supplied. So you do see it creeping higher from today's levels, but nothing like the sort of magnitude of increase that you have for oil.
Thanks, Tim. I think we're running out of time. The last question, somebody was asking about how do you do your scenarios and projections. So could you just briefly mention about the WEO model, and maybe we can point people to our website, which has more information on that.
Yeah. So we use a so-called world energy model, which is something that we've developed in-house. It's a large-scale simulation model for the global energy system. It's very useful in terms of thinking through the impact of policies on the energy system. So it is the way that we design our scenarios is largely around potential trajectories for government policies around the world and what implications they have for the energy system. So the big difference, obviously, between the main scenario that we presented today, I mean, it incorporates, in the case of Mexico, the key elements of Mexico's climate COP21 pledge, plus other announcements that have been made in the context of the energy reform. In a 2-degree scenario, we take a different approach. We define the endpoint, which is a trajectory consistent with keeping the rise in global average temperatures to under 2 degrees Celsius, and then work backwards to what would it take to achieve that. And so we have the necessary flexibility with the world energy model, which is quite a disaggregated model that contains lots of sort of sectoral detail and lots of disaggregation also on the supply side, and to think through the implications of some of these different trajectories for the global energy system.
And in terms of the way this specific work is designed, also, if I could add, Tim, we had a great deal of buy-in and a great deal of support also from colleagues in SENA and other parts of the other ministries as well. A number of members of our team went to visit Mexico and made sure that these exercises were that they were in keeping with the policies that are being announced. And we were fortunate also to have a secondee from SENA to join us for last year to help us out on this work. So a great deal of collaboration, a great deal of modeling, and this is the outcome.
Can I just address a few other questions that I see coming up on the screen? One was in relation to the inclusion of high efficiency gas combined heat and power as a form of clean energy. Yes, we're aware that that's included in the definition of clean energy, and that's reflected in our work. And there's a question about whether we are including nuclear energy into our definition of renewables. No, we don't. I may have left some doubt on that in the way that they were combined in that first chart, but the definition there was low carbon, and there we make a distinction in our definitions also between nuclear and renewable energy. And I think those were the main points of clarification that we could do immediately. If there are other elements of this that you would wish to see, where you have some to see some answers from our side, I think there is the possibility for additional feedback, and we also have the World Energy Outlook mail address, which is weo@iea.org. We would welcome your feedback on that address as well.
Thank you very much, Tim and Ali. We've run out of time, so I'd like to thank everybody for their attention and participation in today's webinar. The presentation should be available by the end of this week on the IEA's YouTube website, and we'll be sending you a link to that. Please feel free to share with your colleagues. For us, it's been a real pleasure to conduct this webinar, which we hope you found useful. We, of course, would like to thank Senair and Anna Lepore, our IEA staff at Senair, for all their support and helping us organize these webinars. We will continue to organize other energy efficiency webinars. And just as a note, the information that was presented today from the Mexico Energy Outlook, also the WEO energy and air pollution are available for free on our website, and the information about the modeling as well. So we'll keep you informed, and please do not hesitate to contact us if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.